Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into a topic that's universally understood, but rarely appreciated historically: sleep. Or to be more precise, the nocturnal habits of medieval people, which you'll find are far stranger and more fascinating than our modern routines could ever suggest. So before you settle in with your memory foam pillow, please hit that like button and consider subscribing if you genuinely appreciate the history I share here. And drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from and what your local time is. I always love seeing our global community gather. Now dim those screens, maybe fire up a white noise app for that gentle ambient sound. Let's drift together into this evening's historical journey. Before modern electricity, social media algorithms, and the obsession with sleep hygiene, the average medieval person approached the night with a routine that would utterly baffle the contemporary melatonin advocate. This wasn't continuous rest. It was segmented sleep, a perfectly natural two-phase rest cycle, essentially cut clean in half, much like a rustic piece of bread or a thick, stale medieval biscuit. The structure was incredibly simple. After the sun disappeared, most residents went to bed quite early, sinking into what they termed the first sleep. Then, 4 or so hours later, they would deliberately wake up, spending the next 60 to 120 minutes engaged in what we can only call medieval midnight multitasking. This wasn't a recognized disorder like insomnia. It was simply the accepted way rest worked and was not considered a failure. This watch period between the two sleep cycles was viewed as practical, highly productive, and occasionally quite social. People used the time to pray, study religious manuscripts, stoke the embers of the fire, or check on their livestock, because nothing derails a deep slumber like the nagging thought of an unsupervised pig or wondering if your goat is still secure in the yard. This practical wakefulness was key to the rhythm of life. And yes, this interval was also widely regarded as the optimal time for marital relations. Medieval doctors and etiquette guides suggested the body felt refreshed and the mind was tranquil during this break, which is likely a polite medical opinion for, "You're too tired to pick a fight now." So if you've ever felt romantic for getting up to bring your partner a breakfast pastry, remember your medieval ancestors set a much different standard. The second sleep would commence after this productive interlude and typically last right up until daybreak. Everyone, from cloistered monks to field workers, participated in this nightly pattern. Even major authors like Chaucer included casual references to it, proving that even in medieval literature, characters were casually writing about fragmented sleep schedules. Strangely enough, current research actually hints that segmented sleep might be the more innate human cycle. This two-part rest phase actually aligns perfectly with how our circadian rhythms function when not overwhelmed by artificial light. So, the next time you find yourself abruptly conscious at 3 a.m., resist the urge to worry. Don't panic. Just quietly note, yes, the vigil has commenced, and symbolically tend to a virtual hearth or check on your house cat. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution, with its relentless factory schedules, the introduction of gaslight, and a rising cultural emphasis on continuous productivity, that society began to push for the concept of 8 uninterrupted hours, as if sleep were a track event. In the medieval world, waking up midway through the night was not considered a personal failing. It was simply the accepted schedule, and everyone followed it whether they liked it or not. Let's shift focus to the actual surfaces they slept on, or rather, the medieval approximation of a bed. In today's world, we obsess over thread counts, cooling gel technology, luxury mattresses, and whether our bedding is cloud-like. In medieval Europe, a bed was often just a collection of organic matter that used to be living, now flattened under the weight of poor insulation and unspoken regrets. The typical peasant bed consisted of a straw mattress known as a pallet. This was quite literally straw or hay stuffed into a large sack of rough fabric, if they had the luxury of a sack. If not, it was just straw piled directly on the floor, possibly damp from the earth, and possibly already claimed by a barnyard animal. These pallets were not comfortable by any measure, but they were certainly better than nothing. which was the alternative. Straw was cheap, plentiful, and a decent insulator against the persistent cold. It was also, unfortunately, a paradise for harboring insects, lice, and the occasional field mouse, which turned sleeping into an exercise in cautious stillness. If it itched, you ignored it. If it bit, you simply shifted slightly and hoped for the best, a genuine testament to endurance. If a family could afford a bit more money, or at least value their functional back, they might elevate the straw mattress onto a basic wooden frame. This didn't change the quality of the sleep dramatically, but it did reduce the chances of waking up with a beetle actively exploring your ear canal. Linens were a rare, high-status treat. Most commoners slept in the same tunic and hose they wore all day. Pajamas weren't really a concept, and neither was personal space. Whole families, children, parents, maybe a visiting grandparent, sometimes a servant, all slept together in the same space, often on the same communal straw pile. If you got too warm, you could always roll into your cousin's elbow or use the dog as a pillow. Nobles, of course, had proper beds. Large, carved wooden frames, feather mattresses, embroidered sheets, and massive canopies to keep out the aggressive drafts and hopefully the worst of the lice. These beds were so valuable and ornate that they were frequently passed down in wills. You didn't just inherit land, you inherited Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy, yet priceless, feather bed. Still, for most medieval folks, a bed wasn't a place of comfort and rest. It was a place to avoid freezing, to steer clear the chickens, and maybe, just maybe, to dream of being wealthy enough to one day sleep on something that didn't squawk or rustle. When we hear the term nightcap today, we think of a cozy little drink, perhaps something with whiskey, a warm fire, and a highly questionable decision. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap wasn't a beverage. It was a hat, a real, tangible, and often rather ridiculous-looking piece of fabric specifically designed to keep your head from completely freezing off while you slept. You see, insulation was not exactly the strong point of medieval architecture. Stone walls, drafty thatched roofs, and windows made of thin animal horn or oiled parchment didn't stand a chance against the cold. And true central heating, that was called a family dog. So to preserve precious body heat at night, especially since heat escapes fastest through the scalp, medieval people adopted the humble nightcap. These hats came in various shapes and sizes, but the most iconic version was often long and pointed, like something you'd expect on a wizard who moonlights as a chimney sweep. They were typically made from wool, linen, or whatever insulating scrap could be spared without angering the family goat. For men, it was a practical necessity. For women, it sometimes doubled as a coif or head wrap, which also served the dual purpose of maintaining modesty and covering hair that hadn't seen soap since the last major religious holiday. Beyond mere warmth, nightcaps carried a subtle social weight too. In certain regions, married women were expected to keep their heads covered at all times. Yes, even while asleep. The cap itself could be embroidered or dyed to reflect a family's wealth or social standing, because nothing says success like going to bed with a miniature flag stitched onto your skull. In more urban settings, the nightcap even became a nonverbal symbol of being off-duty. If you opened your door wearing one, it was the polite medieval way of saying, "I'm not dressed for conversation, and this hat means go away." Of course, nightcaps were usually paired with night shirts, which were essentially just long, loose tunics. Picture Ebenezer Scrooge, but without the haunted moral lesson. Sleepwear wasn't glamorous, but it was practical, itchy, and occasionally quite flammable near an open hearth. Today, the idea of sleeping next to a complete stranger is generally limited to red-eye flights, overly ambitious camping trips, or the occasional bizarre Airbnb mix-up. But in medieval Europe, this was completely normal, expected, and not at all optional for travelers. Let's say you're a traveling merchant, a pilgrim, or just someone whose mule finally gave up halfway to Norwich. You manage to find an inn, a rare luxury in itself, and ask for a place to sleep. What you get is not a private room or a dedicated bed or even a particularly clean patch of floor. What you get is a spot in a bed that is likely already occupied. Medieval inns operated more like human bunkhouses than modern hotels. Privacy was not a concept. It was efficient use of resources. If the bed had space, you were sharing it, usually with complete strangers who might snore like a bear, talk in their sleep, or have a suspicious number of boils. This was not considered rude or inappropriate. It was simply the economic reality. Beds could host 2, 3, even 4 travelers, depending on the size of the bed and the social tolerance of the occupants. In larger cities, you might end up in a dormitory-like hall with rows of beds and absolutely zero personal space. Snoring contests were routine and unjudged. Elbow territory was fiercely contested. Sometimes men and women were separated, but in many of the lowest-cost lodgings, the division was purely based on available space. Some more organized inns tried to assign beds by profession: blacksmiths with blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, and thieves with other thieves, allegedly. But often it was simply first come, first sprawled. And while this might sound like a nightmare to modern germaphobes, back then it was a genuine upgrade from sleeping outdoors with the wolves, the rain, and the occasional opportunistic bandit. Worried about theft? Many travelers slept with their purse tied securely to their belt or tucked deep under their clothes. Others slept directly on top of their bundles, turning their meager luggage into both a pillow and a primitive alarm system. If someone moved your bag, it usually meant you were about to wake up poor. The rich, of course, did not suffer this fate. Nobles traveled with large entourages, encamped in relative comfort, or demanded their own rooms if an innkeeper valued their roof and their custom. In the medieval world, going to bed wasn't just about pulling up a blanket and drifting off. It was a spiritual operation, a nightly gamble where the stakes were your eternal soul. People didn't just sleep, they prepared to potentially die in their sleep. Hence the popularity of intense bedtime prayers. Forget lavender spray, a cup of chamomile, or calming podcasts. Medieval sleepers wound down with confessions, psalms, and soul-cleansing spiritual clauses just in case they expired somewhere between the good night and the dawn. The idea was simple. You could die at any moment from illness, fire, the devil, or simply by being over 30 in the year 1247. So you better say your prayers, not because it was inherently comforting, but because hell was terrifying and you absolutely did not want to show up uninvited, unwashed, and spiritually disheveled. One common version, which is still known today, began, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." Sweet, right? Except it's basically a legal document acknowledging death as a likely bedtime outcome. Many adults had a whole catalog of prayers for different threats, one for when you were feeling guilty, one for when you thought the devil might be hiding in the rafters, and one for plague prevention, which unfortunately aged poorly. Some even prayed to specific saints known for watching over sleepers, kind of like holy bouncers guarding your soul at the club door. The really devout monks, nuns, and the more anxious nobles ended their day with Compline, the final, often lengthy prayer service before bed. After Compline, they took a vow of absolute silence, the Magnum Silentium, which wasn't hard because everyone was already exhausted, underfed, and mildly afraid of the dark. Children were also strongly encouraged to pray, in part because it was good for their souls, and in part because it gave them something productive to do other than ask why the dog was in their bed again. Parents reminded them that angels were watching, which sounds adorable until you realize it was less guardian angel and more celestial surveillance system. In short, prayer before sleep was less about peace and more about last-minute damage control. Think of it like medieval antivirus software. You hoped it worked, even if you didn't fully understand how it functioned. In the modern world, dreams are usually dismissed as random nonsense, stress, too much cheese before bed, or your brain trying to file paperwork in the dark. But in the medieval world, dreams were taken very seriously. as an eternal consequence is serious. Dreams weren't just physiological blips. They were considered messages from God, saints, the Virgin Mary, the devil, your guardian angel, or possibly that weird relic you kissed last Sunday. Some dreams were divine revelations. Others were demonic temptations designed to lead you astray. Either way, you were obliged to pay attention and possibly write it down, confess it immediately, or even fast for 3 days just to be absolutely safe. Theologians, monks, and self-proclaimed visionaries spent an alarming amount of time interpreting dreams. Entire texts were dedicated to decoding the symbolic language of the night. Dreamt of fire? That might be hell. Dreamt of clear water? That could mean purification or drowning. Dreamt of a man with a goat's head juggling fish? You'd better call a priest immediately and possibly move to a new village. Medieval people genuinely believed that what happened in dreams mattered because your soul was still active while your body rested. This meant that your actions in a dream could reveal hidden sins or spiritual weaknesses you weren't even aware of in waking life. That mildly embarrassing dream about stealing a loaf of bread? That might be your subconscious confessing your guilt for real-world gluttony or just simple hunger. But still, better to confess it anyway, just in case. Monks and nuns often recorded their nightly visions and shared them with spiritual superiors. Some were celebrated for having holy visions during sleep. Others were quietly told to eat fewer onions before bed. Of course, dreams weren't just spiritual puzzles. They also made excellent plot devices. Medieval literature is full of dream sequences where knights encounter angels, demons, or metaphorical creatures spouting poetry about virtue. Dreams were basically the Netflix of the medieval world, except with more allegory and far fewer happy endings. The church, predictably, was often suspicious. Not all dreams were divine, and some were believed to be deliberately planted by demons to corrupt the innocent. If you dreamed of something unwholesome or perverse, it could mean your soul was under attack, or that you just slept too close to the fireplace fumes again. In modern times, some people let their pets sleep in the bed. It's a cozy, if occasionally smelly, arrangement. In the Middle Ages, however, sharing a bed with an animal wasn't a quirky personal choice. It was a survival and heating strategy. Let's start with the basics. Medieval homes weren't exactly built for comfort. Stone walls, zero insulation, and drafts so aggressive they probably had names. Central heating that was called the family pig. In peasant homes and many lower-class dwellings, it wasn't just common. It was an advantage for humans and livestock to sleep in the same room, sometimes the same bed, and very often the same pile of straw. Chickens wandered freely. Dogs curled up at your feet. Pigs snorted softly beside the hearth. And if you were lucky, none of them bit you during the night. This wasn't primarily about affection, though medieval people certainly valued their animals. It was about survival. Animals generated body heat. They were warm, dependable, and unlike some relatives, they didn't hog the blanket, only the straw. A large dog could genuinely keep your toes from freezing, and a cow in the corner might raise the room temperature by a degree or two, which in the depths of January felt like a miracle. Medieval homes, especially those of the lower classes, often had just one room for everything: cooking, eating, sleeping, and occasionally dying. Everyone, humans and animals alike, made do with the same space. Children might be nestled between parents and a goat. A chicken might serve as an impromptu alarm clock. We won't ask too many questions about hygiene. For wealthier families, this wasn't as common. Nobles didn't typically sleep next to their full-size livestock, though they might still have lapdogs in bed. This was often not for heat, but for fashion and, hilariously, for flea redistribution, hoping the pests would prefer the dog's coat over their master's skin. Some castles even had separate sleeping areas for favored animals because nothing says power like a dog with its own room and title. There were obvious drawbacks, of course. Animals are loud. They wander. And they are not, historically speaking, known for respecting personal space. But medieval people adapted. A hoof in the face at 3 a.m.? Just part of the bedtime routine. If you've ever had to share a room at a youth hostel and thought, this is a bit much, allow us to introduce the medieval monastic dormitory, a place where comfort went to die quietly under a vow of silence. Monasteries did not believe in personal space, softness, or fun, really. The typical dormitory housed dozens of monks, all sleeping in a single large room, usually arranged in neat rows like morally upright sardines. Beds, if you could call them that, were often wooden planks, sometimes with a straw mattress if the abbot was feeling generous, or if it was a feast day. You slept fully clothed, not just out of modesty, but because getting dressed in the dark at 2 a.m. for mandatory prayers was more painful than just going to bed already prepared. The monastic uniform, including robe, belt, and sandals, doubled as spiritual armor and poor insulation. Under the strict rule of Saint Benedict, silence was enforced, not merely suggested. There were no pillows, no privacy curtains, and absolutely no talking. If you rolled over and groaned too loudly, you might find yourself on chamber pot duty for a week. Snoring, however, was a gray area. You couldn't control it, but if it became relentlessly disruptive, the Lord might still hold you accountable, or at least your cellmates would. Lighting was minimal, one candle, maybe a single oil lamp. You didn't need to see, you just needed to lie still and not sin. Despite the austerity, monks believed their Spartan beds were a form of training for the afterlife, a preparation for the soul's journey by denying the flesh any excess luxury. Sleep was not a pleasure. It was a necessity monitored and scheduled like everything else in their existence. Some monks even chose to sleep sitting up just to avoid any hint of luxury, to discourage dreams which could lead to sin, or to ensure they were instantly ready for the call to prayer. Compared to this, peasant straw piles and snoring pigs almost seem luxurious. At least the pig didn't actively judge you for rolling over twice. Let's talk about something that would horrify most modern sleepers: waking up voluntarily at 2 a.m. and not for a bathroom break or a doomed scroll, but for prayer. Loud, cold, candlelit prayer. In medieval monasteries, this was standard practice and a non-negotiable part of the canonical hours. Monks and nuns followed a rigid daily schedule that included matins, the first service of the day. And by day, we mean the darkest, coldest part of the night, when even the owls were still deciding whether to wake up. The bell would toll, often rung by someone who drew the short straw, and the entire dormitory of robed, sleep-deprived souls would shuffle off to the chapel in silence, still in full clothing. The only layering system they believed in was spiritual. Inside the chapel, by the flickering, smoky candlelight and under the echo of stone vaults, they would chant psalms, recite scriptures, and try their absolute best not to fall asleep on their feet, which was a genuine documented issue. There are records of monks being punished for dozing mid-prayer, usually with extra chores or the very thing they were trying to avoid: more prayers. You fell asleep in matins? Congratulations, you now get to lead the next one. Matins could last an hour or more. Some particularly enthusiastic orders stretched it to 2. Imagine trying to stay spiritually engaged while your stomach reminds you that dinner was a bowl of lentils and a moral lesson, and your body is actively shutting down. After the service, monks would either return to bed for their second sleep or, in stricter orders, move straight into study or manual labor, because nothing says holy discipline like threshing wheat on 4 hours of fragmented rest. Why so early? The idea was to sacrifice comfort and dedicate the first and quietest part of the night to God, uninterrupted by the temptations of daylight, warmth, or normal REM cycles. It was a powerful symbol of devotion once you got over the numb feet, the candle smoke, and Brother Ambrose's perpetually off-key chanting. In the modern world, sleeping alone is often framed as a luxury, a sign of independence, peace, or just an ability to control the blanket. In the medieval world, though, sleeping alone was considered suspicious, impractical, or just downright unsafe. Let's start with the basics: warmth. Beds, as we've established, weren't exactly toasty. Stone walls and open chimneys didn't do much to trap heat, and central heating was still several plagues away. So people shared beds for body heat, not out of intimacy, but out of basic thermal desperation. Children slept with siblings, parents, and sometimes the neighbor's kid if they were visiting. It was like a sleepover, but nobody asked if you wanted to be there. But beyond warmth, there was a profound spiritual and practical reason for sleeping in groups. Many people believed the night was when the devil worked overtime. Alone in the dark, your soul might be vulnerable to temptation or, worse, possession. Having others nearby created a kind of moral buffer zone. If something went wrong, at least someone would witness it or, perhaps more practically, catch the demon first. For children, being alone at night was practically unthinkable, not just for comfort, but because ghosts, fairies, and wandering spirits were all an accepted part of the nightly landscape. Tales warned against solitary sleep as a gateway to mischief and spiritual peril, and unlike today's bedtime stories, these tales rarely ended in hugs. They often ended in disappearances. Even married couples often shared their beds with children, servants, or random guests. Privacy was not a concept so much as a modern myth. In fact, the idea of two people sleeping alone in a giant bed was so foreign that it would have been considered either wasteful or deeply, deeply suspicious. In religious contexts, even monks often slept communally, and if someone was assigned to sleep alone, it was often for disciplinary reasons. Yes, in some cases, being alone in bed was literally a punishment. The logic was medievally sound. Solitary sleep grants opportunity for sin. Group sleep ensures public accountability. Next time you're curled up in your own bed with your own blanket in a room that doesn't smell like goat, enjoy the silence. In medieval times, you'd probably have 2 kids, a sheepdog, and a cousin in there with you, all of them snoring. If you've ever accidentally fallen asleep sitting up in a lecture, a carriage, or a dentist's waiting room, you probably woke up with a crick in your neck and a deep sense of regret. But in the Middle Ages, sleeping upright wasn't an accident, it was a lifestyle for some. Some medieval folks, particularly the wealthy or the religiously devout, chose to sleep propped up rather than lying completely flat. Why? A few reasons, none of them particularly restful. First, there was a medical belief that lying flat was bad for digestion, the lungs, or the general balance of the bodily humors. In a world where doctors thought a sneeze could rearrange your soul, this logic made perfect sense. Upright sleeping, they believed, helped avoid congestion of the brain, which sounds ominous, but mostly meant don't drown in your own phlegm. Second, there were powerful spiritual concerns. Lying flat was considered too close to the posture of the dead. You didn't want to confuse God or, worse, attract attention from the angel of death by sleeping in the same position used at funerals. Superstitious? Absolutely. But when your local priest doubled as the community's health consultant, you picked your battles carefully. As a result, people often slept partially reclined, supported by large bolsters, thick pillows, or the wooden headboard equivalent of a medieval lazy boy. Nobles sometimes had their beds rigged with angled supports to maintain a semi-seated posture, perfect for digesting one's evening meat pie or for fending off surprise demon attacks. Monks took it a step further. In stricter orders, they might even sleep sitting upright on a bench or leaning against a cold wall with nothing but a hood to muffle the discomfort. It wasn't about health. It was about discipline and avoiding sin. If you were too comfortable, you might dream. If you dreamed, you might sin. If you sinned, well, welcome to confession at 5 a.m. Needless to say, this wasn't about quality rest. It was about virtue, perpetual discomfort, and mildly confusing theology. Forget haunted dreams or goblins under the bed. For medieval people, the real monsters of the night were already in the sheets, small, persistent, and entirely uninterested in your prayers. We're talking, of course, about fleas, lice, and the medieval bedroom's unofficial mascot, the bedbug. Let's not sugarcoat it. Hygiene wasn't exactly medieval Europe's strong suit. Baths were rare, laundry was expensive, and soap was sometimes made from substances better left unnamed. Add that to straw-filled mattresses, shared bedding, and the occasional live chicken underfoot, and you've got the perfect environment for an all-you-can-eat pest buffet. Fleas and lice were so common, they were practically considered permanent roommates. Peasants dealt with them daily. Nobles, despite their satin sheets and feather beds, were not exempt. In fact, some richer households had dedicated nitpickers, actual servants tasked with removing lice from their employer's hair and clothing. Imagine that as your job title, Master of the Royal Scalp. Bedbugs, meanwhile, were the silent assassins of medieval sleep. They hid in wooden bed frames, mattress seams, and even the cracks in stone walls, emerging at night to feast like tiny vampires. If you ever wondered why medieval people wore nightcaps and often slept fully clothed, it wasn't always about warmth. Sometimes it was purely pest defense armor. Solutions ranged from mildly effective to impressively deranged. Some households burned strong-smelling herbs like wormwood or tansy to repel bugs. Others slept with garlic, onions, or even ashes placed strategically in the bed, which may have done little for the pests, but certainly kept romance to a minimum. One more organized approach was the use of wicker traps, simple baskets placed near the bed to encourage the pest to crawl into them, where they could be disposed of in the morning. Fleas were even seen as symbols of sin or moral impurity, biting reminders of the fall of man and, well, poor bedding choices. So while modern sleep is interrupted by buzzing phones and streetlights, medieval sleep was more likely disturbed by scratching, twitching, and the subtle feeling that something was crawling on your shin. Because it definitely was. We've all had restless nights. But have you ever tried falling asleep while wearing 100 pounds of iron? No? Well, in the Middle Ages, some people did exactly that, because apparently nothing says sweet dreams like being prepared to joust in your sleep. Now, to be clear, most people, even knights, didn't regularly sleep in a full suit of armor. It was hot, heavy, and loud. Trying to roll over in a suit of chainmail is a bit like trying to nap inside a bag of cutlery. But during wartime or while traveling through hostile territory, sleeping partially armored was considered the safer choice. Comfort was optional. Survival was highly recommended. A knight on campaign might remove only his helmet and gauntlets, keeping his mail shirt or a breastplate on just in case enemies decided to stage a midnight surprise party. There's nothing quite like waking up to the sound of hooves and having to suit up while still half dreaming about turnips. In castles under siege, men-at-arms might even sleep with their swords or axes at their side, like some very aggressive bedtime security blankets. Shields doubled as pillows. And if the enemy managed to breach the walls, well, at least you wouldn't have to waste time getting dressed. While you were tucked away with your straw, dog, and possibly a field mouse, the medieval city wasn't entirely asleep. The hours of darkness were fraught with risk, fire, crime, and general disorder, so most urban areas relied on the night watch to maintain security. The watch was a system of policing where men from community took turns patrolling the streets from sunset to sunrise. This was originally a mandatory civic duty, often dreaded by the citizens who had to serve. These watchmen weren't just looking for criminals. They were the eyes and ears of the community. Their duties included lighting and extinguishing the town's street lamps, enforcing strict curfews. The word curfew itself comes from the Old French couvre-feu, meaning to cover the fire, and most importantly, sounding the alarm in case of fire or attack. The watchmen were equipped with weapons, often a staff, a sword, or a polearm, and their primary function was to detain suspicious characters until daylight, when formal justice could be administered. They were also responsible for locking the city gates at nightfall. For the ordinary person inside the city walls, the steady sound of the watchman's bell or his cry marking the hours was a comforting sound of safety, a reminder that someone was actively keeping the monsters of the night at bay. However, as the system evolved, especially in larger cities, people began to pay substitutes to take their place, leading to a professional, though often criticized and sometimes drunk, force. Still, the watch was the final layer of protection that allowed the segmented, uncomfortable, and spiritually intense sleep of the medieval world to happen at all. Sleeping wasn't always a personal luxury. For a knight on campaign, it was merely a necessary evil, a brief, uncomfortable suspension of vigilance. Of course, sleeping in armor wasn't exactly restorative. Iron isn't breathable, and chainmail had a nasty habit of pinching skin or digging into the spine. Add in cold stone floors, minimal bedding, and the constant ambient sounds of snoring comrades and crackling torches, and you've got a sleep environment that ranks somewhere below an airport terminal on the comfort scale. Even those not actively fighting sometimes wore light protective gear while sleeping in dangerous regions. Traveling merchants or guards on watch duty might nap in gambesons, thick quilted jackets that offered a bit of padding and slightly more protection than the moral support of prayer alone. The discomfort was a trade-off for immediate defense. And lest we forget, armor wasn't exactly subtle. If you rolled over the wrong way, you might clank so loudly that everyone else woke up and instantly assumed the apocalypse had arrived again. In a time when nightly demons, lice infestations, and pigs sharing your bed weren't considered unusual inconveniences, you might think that sleepwalking was just one more thing to tolerate. But oh no, it was much more dramatic than that. In the Middle Ages, if you started wandering around in your sleep, people didn't simply chalk it up to stress or exhaustion. They immediately assumed you were possessed, bewitched, or had unfinished business with the Holy Roman Empire. Sleepwalking, or noctambulation, if you wanted to impress the local monk, was poorly understood and deeply feared. The idea that someone could rise from their straw pallet, shuffle across the room, and stare blankly at a wall was less a harmless parasomnia and more a devil's rehearsal dinner. Accounts from the time suggest people were genuinely spooked by sleepwalkers. Picture this: a man in a long nightshirt, a candle flickering in his hand, his eyes glazed, mumbling Latin he didn't actually speak while stepping over livestock. You think ghost or heretic or both. And depending on your local priest, an exorcism might be swiftly scheduled before breakfast. Some believed sleepwalking was caused by bad humors, especially too much black bile, which was the medieval catch-all for anything they couldn't medically explain. Others thought it happened because the soul was temporarily released during sleep, leaving the body free to bumble around like an unattended mule. This philosophical and medical uncertainty fueled the fear. To prevent these nightly adventures, people tried everything: herbal remedies, praying over their beds, hanging iron charms, iron being known to repel malevolent spirits, or in more rural and practical areas, just tying the person's leg to a chair. If that sounds extreme, consider that some medieval homes had open hearths, knives everywhere, and chamber pots just waiting to be tragically overturned by a somnambulist. In one curious twist, there were rumors of people climbing onto rooftops in their sleep. Whether or not these accounts were exaggerated, the fear of leaping dreamers led to barred windows and occasional theological debates about whether a person could sin while unconscious. Thankfully, most sleepwalkers just paced, muttered, or attempted to open imaginary doors. But if someone sleepwalked into a church, locals might treat it as a divine sign or call for a cleansing ritual just to cover all spiritual bases. The medieval life taught people anything, it was how to sleep through chaos. Church bells, thunderstorms, screaming livestock, the occasional siege. For the sleep-deprived denizens of the Middle Ages, these were just ambient noises, the medieval version of white noise. Let's start with the bells. Church bells marked every sacred and secular moment of the day: sunrise, prayer times, meals, and, of course, the ungodly hour of matins at 2 or 3 a.m. If you lived anywhere near a monastery, your dreams were likely soundtracked by regular tolling. At some point, the brain just accepted it. Bells became the lullaby of an overscheduled soul. And it wasn't just bells. Storms were frequent and terrifying. With no weather apps or triple-glazed windows, you experienced every clap of thunder like the world might end. Roofs leaked, windows rattled, and chimneys howled like banshees. Still, people slept. They had to. Work didn't stop for insomnia. Neither did plowing, praying, or running from Vikings. Speaking of which, invasions and apocalyptic events weren't always a deal-breaker for bedtime either. In the 14th century, people continued to sleep somehow through famine, war, and even the Black Death. When death carts rolled by in the morning, it was considered more of a grim wake-up call than a cause for panic. And if you didn't wake up, well, some believe that was a mercy. There are even records of people sleeping through earthquakes, barn fires, and angry mobs. Sleep deprivation was common, and bodies adjusted. If you worked from sunup to sundown, ate barely enough to survive, and spent your day dodging mud, taxes, and spiritual damnation, you were going to fall asleep hard. And then there were those who used sleep as a kind of escape hatch. Faced with illness, grief, or fear of the world literally ending, which was forecast roughly every century, some people just curled up under a cloak, mumbled a prayer, and took a nap. There's a strange kind of wisdom in that resignation to rest. In the bitter winter of 1692, the village of Salem, Massachusetts, was cloaked in more than just snow. It was cloaked in tension, suspicion, and a quiet kind of fear that seeped into the timber-framed homes and frozen fields. The people of Salem were Puritan. They believed they were building a holy community in the wilderness, a city on a hill watched by God and eternally stalked by Satan. Life was already hard. The village had recently split from Salem town over politics and religion. Crops had failed. Smallpox had ravaged nearby communities. Wars with native tribes had left many traumatized. There was friction between neighbors, inheritance disputes, and a deep resentment toward outsiders or anyone who didn't quite fit in. Add to this the long, dark, bitter New England winter, and something was bound to break. That break came in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, the village's minister. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began to behave strangely. They screamed uncontrollably. They threw things. They contorted their bodies in unnatural ways. At times they fell silent for hours, eyes wide with terror. Neighbors whispered that they were cursed. The girls claimed they were being pinched and bitten by invisible forces. Reverend Parris, unsure of what to do, called in a local doctor, William Griggs. After failing to find any physical cause, Griggs delivered the devastating diagnosis that would plunge the village into chaos: witchcraft. That single word set fire to the fears already simmering in Salem. In a place where witches were believed to be real, dangerous servants of the devil, the idea was not far-fetched. And now, if the devil could worm his way into the minister's own household, what did that mean for the rest of the community? The girls, prodded by both adults and peers, began naming names. First, they accused women on the margins, social misfits, and outcasts. But soon the accusations would reach the respectable, the wealthy, even the pious. Salem was a small village, but what was about to happen would echo far beyond its borders. What began as whispers in the dark would soon become cries from the gallows, and a legacy of paranoia that still haunts America's history books. Once the idea of witchcraft took root in Salem, it spread like ivy, quiet at first, then strangling everything it touched. The afflicted girls, Betty Parris, Abigail Williams, and soon others like Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis, seemed to grow bolder with each passing day. They convulsed in court, screamed during prayers, and claimed they could see dark spirits hovering over certain villagers. It wasn't just childhood imagination. It was theatrical, public, and, most disturbingly, believed. The first to be accused were those with the least protection, women who already lived on the edges of society. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, was known for muttering to herself when turned away from doorsteps. People claimed her mumbling was a curse. She smoked a pipe. She snapped at children. She fit the mold of a witch because she didn't fit the mold of a Puritan woman. Sarah Osborne hadn't attended church in over a year and had scandalized the community by marrying her indentured servant after her first husband died. A woman who defied convention was clearly suspect. Tituba, the enslaved woman in Reverend Paris's household, was the most exotic of all. Originating from Barbados, her storytelling, accent, and folklore, elements already viewed with suspicion by the stern Puritans, frightened the villagers. Under extreme pressure, possibly even physical beatings, Tituba confessed to witchcraft. But instead of clearing the air, her confession blew the situation wide open. She told a story of a tall man in black, a figure associated with the devil, who asked her to sign a book. She said she saw strange animals, yellow birds, red cats, and even spectral dogs. But most damning of all, she claimed there were other witches in Salem. That was all the court needed to hear. Once Tituba opened the door, others rushed through it. New names were added weekly. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Old grudges were disguised as righteous accusations. Property disputes turned into spectral assaults. If someone's cow died suddenly, it must have been witchcraft. If a baby cried during a prayer, surely that was the devil's doing. The fear became so infectious that not even the innocent dared to speak out. To defend an accused, which was to invite suspicion upon yourself. Silence was safety, and so the web of accusations widened, trapping the village in its sticky, unseen threads. Logic was fading. Hysteria was now in full, frantic control. As accusations mounted and the village reached a fever pitch, the colonial government stepped in. Governor William Phipps, recently appointed and eager to maintain order, established a special court to deal with the chaos. It was called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, from the French meaning to hear and determine. But what it really became was a factory for fear-driven injustice. The court convened in Salem town in June of 1692, and it was no ordinary tribunal. Its rules were warped by panic. Instead of requiring hard evidence or reliable witnesses, it allowed something far more dangerous: spectral evidence. Spectral evidence was testimony that a spirit or specter of the accused had afflicted the victim. In other words, if a person claimed to have seen your ghost-like form in a dream choking them, that was admissible in court. Never mind that the accused could be asleep at church or miles away. It was their spirit doing the devil's work. You couldn't cross-examine a dream, and worse, you couldn't disprove it. Children were now treated as star witnesses. Their seizures, screams, and gasps in court became more theatrical by the day. One girl, Mary Walcott, would fall into fits the moment a suspected witch entered the room. If a prisoner looked at her, she shrieked. If they didn't look at her, she shrieked louder. The performances were mesmerizing, and the judges, including the influential Judge Samuel Sewell and Chief Justice William Stoughton, accepted it all. Defense lawyers? There were none. The concept didn't exist in colonial trials. If you were accused, you stood alone. If you denied the charges, the afflicted girls writhed in agony. If you confessed, you might be spared death, but only if you named others. The system rewarded lies and punished silence. Worse still, the trials became public spectacles. People traveled from nearby towns to witness them. The accused were paraded into court in shackles, often bewildered, often poor, and almost always powerless. And yet, some townsfolk whispered that the girls were faking. Others questioned why only certain types of people were being accused. But few spoke openly. Questioning the court meant questioning the will of God. In Salem, reason had stepped aside, and the law had become a mirror reflecting fear, not justice. On June 10, 1692, the gallows in Salem claimed its first victim, Bridget Bishop. She was not new to scandal. Her reputation, she wore bright red clothing, ran a tavern, and had been accused of witchcraft years earlier, made her an easy target. During her trial, neighbors testified that her spirit pinched them in the night, that their babies died after she passed by, and that she kept enchanted dolls. She denied everything. Still, the court found her guilty. She was led to Gallows Hill, a barren, windswept patch of earth just outside Salem. No prayer, no mercy. The rope was pulled. The crowd watched, and with that single execution, the machinery of death began to churn. The hangings that followed came quickly. On July 19th, 5 more women were executed: Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Some had good standing in the church. Rebecca Nurse, in particular, was a shocking case, an elderly, pious woman beloved in the community. Even the jury initially found her not guilty, but under immense pressure from the court and the afflicted girls, the verdict was reversed. Nurse's final words were whispered through the air like a warning. "I am as innocent as the child unborn," but it didn't matter. The noose did not discriminate. In August, more executions followed. On September 22nd, the deadliest day, 8 people were hanged in a single morning. Among them was Martha Corey, a woman who had doubted the trials early on, and her husband, Giles Corey, who met a different fate. Giles refused to enter a plea. The court, unable to proceed with a trial without one, resorted to an ancient English punishment, peine forte et dure. He was pressed to death. Stones were piled on his chest slowly, cruelly, over 3 days. His final words, as legend has it, were "more weight." By the end of the Hysteria, 19 people had been hanged, 1 pressed to death. At least 5 more died in jail awaiting trial. Dozens confessed falsely to save their lives. Over 200 people were accused. The gallows cast long shadows over Salem, not just on the hill, but in every heart. Fear had become law, and justice, blindfolded, had been led to the scaffold. While the executions claimed the spotlight, hundreds of others sat in cramped, foul-smelling jails, waiting for a verdict or a miracle. Salem's small jail couldn't contain them all. Accused witches were held in neighboring towns like Ipswich and Boston, chained to walls, starving, freezing, and forgotten. Most of the accused weren't witches or even outcasts. They were neighbors, friends, parents, children, people whose only crime was having a quarrel with the wrong person or owning land someone else wanted. In many cases, personal grudges disguised as divine justice drove the accusations. A pig wandered into a neighbor's yard and died? Must be witchcraft. Someone refused to help with firewood? Clearly, they'd cursed the axe. Mary Easty, sister of the executed Rebecca Nurse, was one such case. She was a respected mother of 7 known for her piety. Initially released by the court, she was rearrested days later after new fits from the afflicted girls. Her second arrest sealed her fate. In a final petition to the judges, Mary begged them not for her own life, but that they put a stop to these proceedings before more innocent blood is shed. She was hanged soon after. Another notable case was Dorothy Good, the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good. After her mother's arrest, Dorothy was interrogated and under pressure confessed to being a witch. Her answers, gibberish and fear, were taken as truth. She was imprisoned for 8 months in chains. When finally released, she was mentally broken, never recovering from the trauma. Pregnant women were not spared. Elizabeth Proctor, whose husband John Proctor would later hang, was found guilty and sentenced to die. But because she was pregnant, her execution was delayed. It likely saved her life. She gave birth in jail and was eventually released after the trials ended. Accusations snowballed. Some accused confessed in desperation to avoid death, then named others to shift suspicion away from themselves. Entire families were pulled into the spiral: fathers, wives, daughters. No one was beyond reach. Meanwhile, the jail swelled beyond capacity. Food was scarce, disease spread. Some died awaiting trial, lost in the legal limbo of paranoia, and still new names were added each week. In Salem, it no longer mattered who you were, only who was willing to say your name. By the fall of 1692, the spell of hysteria began to crack. Not because the court came to its senses, but because reality forced its way back in. The turning point came when accusations grew too bold. People who had once supported the trials found themselves suddenly on the wrong side of them. Reverend George Burroughs, a former Salem minister, was arrested and charged with being the ringleader of the witches. He was well-educated, well-spoken, and had previously clashed with influential families in the village. That was enough. But on the day of his execution, Burroughs did something shocking. He stood on the gallows and flawlessly recited the Lord's Prayer, something witches were believed incapable of doing. The crowd fell silent. Some wept. Even hardened observers were shaken, but the execution went on. That moment planted a seed of doubt. Then came the accusation of Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps. Suddenly, the hysteria had reached the top of the colony's social ladder. Phipps, already unnerved by growing criticism and chaos, finally took action. In October 1692, he dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer, halting all pending executions and trials. Public sentiment had decisively shifted. Ministers, once silent or complicit, began to speak out. Increase Mather, one of the colony's most respected theologians, denounced the use of spectral evidence. It were better, he said, that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person should be condemned. A radical thought in a society that had for months believed exactly the opposite. People who had once cheered the trials began to question them. The jails were still full, but the appetite for more blood had dulled. Too many respected figures were being accused. Too many innocent people had been buried. The villagers had begun to see that this wasn't divine justice. It was madness. Confessions dried up. Some accusers backtracked. Others disappeared from public view. And those who had previously shouted the loudest now lowered their eyes. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it had exhausted itself. The public wanted stability. The officials wanted to save face. And Salem, bruised and ashamed, was finally ready to wake from its nightmare. The storm was breaking, but the damage had already been done. By late 1692, the judicial system that had fueled the hysteria began to collapse under the weight of its own absurdity. With the court of Oyer and Terminer disbanded in October, a new, more cautious court, the Superior Court of Judicature, was formed in early 1693. This time things were different. Spectral evidence was no longer allowed, and the judges were noticeably more skeptical of the accuser's wild claims. The result, the convictions slowed dramatically. Many accused witches were acquitted outright. Of the 56 cases brought before the new court, the majority were released. Even those who had already confessed began to recant their testimonies, admitting that fear, torture, or pressure had forced them to lie. The dramatic performances of the afflicted girls lost their persuasive power. The most prominent case in the unraveling of the trials was that of Reverend Samuel Willard, a respected minister who came under suspicion. While he was never formally charged, the fact that such a high-ranking devout man could be suspected highlighted how arbitrary and corrupt the process had become. The court, once ferocious, was now cautious. They began quietly releasing those still in jail, first those with little evidence against them, and eventually even those who had confessed to witchcraft under duress. Meanwhile, families of the executed began to demand justice. John Proctor's children petitioned for the return of his property. Rebecca Nurse's family launched a campaign to clear her name. In time, community shame replaced community fear. Church congregations fractured. Friendships were severed. The very fabric of Salem's social order had been shredded. Governor Phipps, realizing the colony's growing international embarrassment, pardoned the remaining prisoners in 1693. But even freedom came at a cost. Many families had to pay for their own jail fees before being released. Imagine losing your home, your health, and nearly your life only to be handed a bill for the privilege of surviving. By the end of the ordeal, 19 people had been hanged, 1 pressed to death, 5 died in jail, and over 200 had been accused. The court didn't just collapse. It imploded, leaving behind a crater of guilt, grief, and disbelief. The trials had ended, but the healing had not even begun. Salem was a village forever altered by the people it had lost, the justice it had abandoned, and the mirror it was now forced to look into. The gallows were silent, the jails had emptied, but Salem was far from peaceful. The town wasn't haunted by ghosts, but by guilt. What had started with a handful of sick girls had exploded into a communal act of destruction. Families had been torn apart, reputations ruined, and innocent lives ended. And now the survivors had to live in the wreckage. Neighbors could no longer look each other in the eye. The same people who once prayed together had testified against one another. Some of the afflicted girls quietly left town. Others faded from the public eye. A few, like in Putnam Jr., would later express remorse. In 1706, she stood before her congregation and publicly apologized for her role in the trials, blaming delusion by Satan. But for many, the damage was beyond words. The court officials, too, carried their burden. Judge Samuel Sewell, one of the most prominent figures in the trials, was one of the few to admit wrongdoing. In a remarkable act of public penance, he stood during a church service in 1697 while a minister read out his confession and prayer for forgiveness. It was a rare moment of accountability in a time when most tried to forget. But forgetting wasn't easy. The families of the condemned began demanding compensation. Over the years, petitions flooded the Massachusetts government, asking for official pardons, for returned property, for public acknowledgement that the executed were innocent. Slowly, the government responded. In 1711, the colony passed a bill restoring the rights and good names of some of the victims and offered limited financial restitution to their heirs. But even that wasn't comprehensive. Some families, like the Coreys and the Proctors, were left out entirely. Whispers of witchcraft never quite left New England, but in Salem, the shame became part of the town's identity. The village eventually changed its name to Danvers, perhaps to distance itself from its infamous past. Gallows Hill was never officially marked, as if the town hoped to bury not just the dead, but the memory of what had happened. But the memory persisted in sermons, in stories, in the silence between former friends. Salem had not been cursed by witches. It had been cursed by fear, by pride, and by unchecked power. And that curse would linger long after the execution stopped. The Salem witch trials ended more than 3 centuries ago, but their legacy continues to echo, not just in textbooks and historical tours, but in how we understand justice, fear, and the fragility of truth. What happened in 1692 wasn't simply a strange episode of mass hysteria. It was a breakdown of logic, compassion, and legal integrity in the face of panic. Ordinary people, farmers, midwives, ministers, became executioners simply by believing too easily and questioning too little. The courts meant to protect the innocent became tools of oppression. Religion was weaponized. Testimony became theater. And silence became guilt. One of the most chilling aspects of Salem's tragedy is how quickly it unfolded. In a matter of months, fear overcame fact. Old grudges disguised as spiritual warfare became death sentences. It didn't take demons or devils, it only took belief in them. But the trials also taught hard-earned lessons that would ripple through American society. In the years and centuries that followed, the Salem episode would be cited repeatedly in debates about due process and civil liberties. The U.S. Constitution, written nearly a century later, would explicitly prohibit things like ex post facto laws and bills of attainder, measures that had, in effect, doomed the accused in Salem. The guarantee of a right to legal counsel, the right to face your accusers, and the requirement for concrete evidence were hard-won principles forged in part from the ashes of Gallows Hill. In modern times, the phrase witch hunt has become shorthand for political persecution or moral panic, though it's often used with little regard for the real terror those words represent. In truth, Salem was not a metaphor. It was a town where people were hanged for imaginary crimes, betrayed by the very systems designed to protect them. Perhaps the most lasting lesson is this: fear unchecked can become its own form of tyranny. And when fear is legitimized by power, by courts, by churches, by governments, it becomes almost unstoppable. The Salem witch trials are a cautionary tale, not just of one village's descent into madness, but of how easily reason can fall when fear is given authority. The gallows may be gone, the courtroom's quiet, but the warning still stands. Truth is fragile. Justice is not automatic. And history has a habit of repeating itself unless we remember. Fulvia was born around 83 BCE into the elite yet slightly eccentric Fulvii family, an old plebeian house that had long since clawed its way into the upper echelons of Roman politics. Though not one of the oldest patrician clans, the Fulvii had produced consuls, generals, and orators. Their bloodline carried both ambition and a taste for disruption. Fulvia's father, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, was known more for his bumbling speech than his political legacy. His nickname, Bambalio, literally referred to his stammer. But Fulvia, she was no stammer. She was born to command. From a young age, Fulvia would have been surrounded by the sharp-edged world of Roman power. Senators and generals debated policy in her home. Elections and treachery were daily news. She would have seen how politics wasn't just played in the forum, but in marriages, funerals, rumors, and backroom deals. Women in elite Roman households were expected to be quiet partners, refined, educated, and obedient. Fulvia would break all of those expectations. She was wealthy, highly educated, and connected, and she knew it. While her early life remains hazy in the historical record, her later actions suggest a young woman who was observant, politically literate, and utterly unafraid. This wasn't someone who faded into the background. She had a strong personality, a sharp political mind, and a will to act even in the male-dominated space of Roman governance. This was also a period of unprecedented instability. The Republic was unraveling. Civil wars, populist revolts, and power struggles between generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar were turning Rome into a pressure cooker. The old rules were collapsing, and Fulvia came of age right in the middle of it. Rather than recoil from chaos, Fulvia would learn to use it. Her early life didn't produce the kind of modest matron Rome idealized. It produced a woman who saw politics not as a man's world to be feared, but as a battlefield to be mastered. She would go on to marry 3 powerful men, each one a radical player in Roman history. But Fulvia wouldn't just marry power. She would command armies, lead revolts, and become the first Roman woman to appear on coinage, not as a goddess, but as herself. Rome wasn't ready for Fulvia, but she was absolutely ready for Rome. Fulvia's first marriage was to Publius Clodius Pulcher, and it was anything but conventional. Clodius was no ordinary Roman noble. He was a populist agitator, a political arsonist with a flair for chaos, scandal, and street-level power. To many of the Roman elite, he was dangerous. To the masses, he was a hero. And to Fulvia, he was a strategic opportunity. Their marriage, sometime in the early 50s BCE, united Fulvia with a man who had turned the Roman Republic into his personal stage. Clodius was infamous for his theatrical defiance of tradition. He had once disguised himself as a woman to infiltrate a sacred female-only religious ceremony in Caesar's home, scandalous behavior that only seemed to raise his popularity. He later renounced his patrician status to run for the tribunate of the plebs, an office that gave him veto power over the Senate. Clodius understood Rome's street politics better than most, and Fulvia, far from being a passive consort, was right there beside him. She wasn't a silent partner. Roman sources suggest that Fulvia actively participated in her husband's political world. She engaged with his supporters, was visible during his campaigns, and managed their household as a hub for Clodius's political machine. Together, they represented a new kind of Roman power couple, bold, populist, and unapologetically aggressive. But the alliance came at a cost. In 52 BCE, Clodius was murdered on the Appian Way by the bodyguards of his political rival, Titus Annius Milo. His death sent shockwaves through Rome. But Fulvia was not about to mourn quietly. She staged a political funeral that historians still talk about today. She paraded Clodius's mutilated body through the Roman Forum, bloodied wounds exposed for maximum effect. The public was horrified and enraged. Riots erupted. The Senate House was burned to the ground. Fulvia had turned personal grief into a public uprising. This was her first major political act, and it worked. Her ability to manipulate public emotion, use spectacle as strategy, and wield her husband's legacy as a weapon made her a new kind of player in Roman politics. Clodius was gone, but Fulvia had stepped out of the shadow, and Rome would never see her the same way again. Fulvia didn't linger in mourning. In Rome, political capital had a short shelf life, and she understood that better than anyone. Shortly after the violent death of Clodius Pulcher, she entered into a second marriage, this time to Gaius Scribonius Curio, a rising political star and one of Julius Caesar's most passionate supporters. On the surface, Curio seemed an unlikely match. He had a flamboyant reputation and a taste for drama, but beneath the bravado was a sharp political operator. As tribune of the plebs in 50 BCE, Curio wielded enormous influence during one of Rome's most volatile periods. The Republic teetered between war and peace, between Caesar's ambitions and the Senate's resistance. Fulvia saw in Curio not just a husband, but a bridge to the next power block. This was no romantic rebound. It was a calculated alliance. With Clodius gone, Fulvia needed a new political anchor, someone who could carry forward the populist legacy her first husband had built and someone who had Caesar's backing. Curio fit both bills. Through him, Fulvia remained tightly embedded in the volatile, shifting power dynamics of Rome. She didn't just marry into the revolutionary movement, she actively helped shape it. Fulvia ensured Clodius's populist supporters stayed active, subtly rebranding their cause under Curio's leadership and keeping the urban masses politically engaged. This move demonstrated her acute understanding of political continuity and the critical need to retain street-level loyalty. But the Roman world was collapsing fast. Tensions between Caesar and Pompey exploded into civil war. Curio immediately threw himself into the fight, taking Caesar's side. Fulvia, as always, remained politically and logistically involved. She reportedly helped organize support and manage resources for her husband's campaign, effectively running a war room from their home. In 49 BCE, Curio led a military expedition to Africa to secure Caesar's position, but it was a disaster. He was ambushed and killed by the forces of King Juba of Numidia. His death was brutal, and his army annihilated. Once again, Fulvia was widowed. And once again, Rome waited to see if she would fade into the background as tradition dictated. She didn't. Curio's death only solidified her status as a political widow with dangerous, formidable resilience. She had now lost 2 husbands to Rome's civil unrest, and both had died fighting for populist, anti-establishment causes. This unique position gave her immense moral authority with Caesar's veteran soldiers and the urban poor. But Fulvia was far from finished. Her most audacious partnership and her most dramatic chapter was still to come. Fulvia's third and most famous marriage was to Mark Antony, the ambitious general and loyal right-hand man of Julius Caesar. Their union, forged sometime around 47 BCE, wasn't merely a romantic attachment. It was a ruthless merger of political power. Fulvia had already proven herself as a master of Roman street politics and financial mobilization. Antony, rising rapidly through the military and political ranks, desperately needed that kind of savvy support and anchoring presence in Rome while he was away on campaign. Together, they quickly formed one of the most politically potent couples of the late Republic, a dynamic duo capable of wielding both the dagger and the decree. By the time of their marriage, Fulvia was no stranger to blood and betrayal. She had buried 2 husbands and outmaneuvered countless enemies. Antony was no stranger to scandal either. He drank, he gambled, and his personal life was notoriously chaotic. But with Fulvia, he had found someone who could do more than entertain him. She could defend his interests, hold his complex web of alliances together, and rally critical popular support when he was away. Antony, despite his brash exterior, understood her strategic value perfectly. He allowed Fulvia to exercise a level of public authority that no Roman woman had publicly wielded before. She often opened his correspondence, issued orders in his absence, sat in on key political meetings, and directly influenced appointments and land allocations. Roman sources, mostly hostile and deeply misogynistic, depicted her as overbearing, shrewish, and pathologically power-hungry. But what truly disturbed the conservative elite most wasn't her ambition. It was that she acted like a Roman man in a world that had no formal language or category for such a woman. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, the Republic was plunged into chaos once more. Antony rushed to secure his position as Caesar's natural political heir. But it was Fulvia who held Rome itself during his initial movements. While Antony formed the Second Triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus, Fulvia acted as his authoritative representative in the capital, managing patronage networks, coordinating with street gangs for public safety, and ensuring Antony's vast network of supporters remained mobilized and financed. She even helped arrange a fragile political truce and alliance between the rivals by marrying her daughter, Clodia, to the young Octavian, a shrewd move that, while temporary, bought Antony crucial time. In public, Fulvia appeared not just as Antony's wife, but unequivocally as his proxy. Roman coins were minted bearing both Antony's image and her name, an unprecedented acknowledgement of her political and financial status. She wasn't hidden in the shadows of power. She stood directly in its full, blinding glare. But power in Rome was always borrowed and fleeting, and Fulvia was about to test the very limits of how far a woman could push before the system snapped back violently. While Mark Antony pursued military campaigns and political deals across the Eastern Roman world, it was Fulvia who controlled the streets of Italy. She was his regent in all but name, operating in a period where violence, bribery, and raw influence were the primary tools of order. Fulvia proved she could play the high-stakes game as well as, if not better than, any man in the Senate. Rome in the aftermath of Caesar's assassination was a political battlefield without swords. Power had become a moving target, constantly changing hands. Fulvia understood this and ruthlessly anchored Antony's authority in the capital by becoming his complete political substitute. She directed allies, dealt with the urban plebs, negotiated with various political factions, and most daringly, waged war with words and silver. She financed loyal troops, offered large bribes to keep public order, and ensured that any legislation passed favored Antony's future prospects. Ancient sources, especially hostile ones like Appian and Dio Cassius, paint Fulvia as manipulative, shrewish, and even bloodthirsty. But beneath the clear misogynistic exaggeration lies the simple truth of a woman actively engaging in high-level politics in a world that had no protocol for a woman doing anything beyond weaving and mourning. Fulvia was building coalitions, backing military commanders, and even issuing decrees, functions normally reserved exclusively for senators and consuls. She also made highly visible public appearances and maintained strong relationships with veteran soldiers, a politically vital demographic in the power struggles of the late Republic. While Antony was campaigning in the East, Fulvia was often the unflinching face of his authority in Italy, meeting with centurions, influencing decisions about land distribution, and reminding the soldiers that their continued loyalty to Antony came with immediate rewards. But this accumulation of naked power came at a steep cost. Roman aristocrats, particularly the faction aligned with Octavian, Caesar's heir, and Antony's increasingly bitter rival, resented Fulvia's towering influence. They viewed her as a meddling, vulgar woman with far too much sway over legions, laws, and loyalties. Her ability to act without constant male guardianship was not just threatening, it was unprecedented and genuinely terrifying to the establishment. Fulvia wasn't naive. She knew the tension between Antony and Octavian was growing daily. She could see that their fragile alliance was cracking, and she understood something neither man seemed to fully grasp yet. The Republic wasn't big enough for both of them. So Fulvia began preparing for the next inevitable phase. Not diplomacy, but confrontation. She had stood behind power long enough. Now she was ready to take it directly into her own hands. In 41 BCE, Fulvia did the unthinkable. She went to war against Octavian, the future Augustus. And she didn't do it quietly or from the shadows. With her husband Mark Antony still stationed in the east, Fulvia and Lucius Antonius, Antony's younger brother and a sitting consul, took it upon themselves to challenge Octavian's authority in Italy. The stated cause? Ostensibly, it was to defend Antony's interests and protect the land rights of Roman veterans loyal to him. But underneath it all, Fulvia's fingerprints were everywhere. This was not just politics. This was a military rebellion openly led by a Roman woman, the first and only time in Roman history that a woman would actively provoke and organize a full-scale civil war. The conflict, known as the Perusine War, was triggered by Octavian's controversial land redistribution program, which ruthlessly displaced many Italians to reward his own soldiers. Fulvia seized on the growing public discontent, skillfully portraying Octavian as a tyrant and a traitor to Caesar's sacred legacy. With Lucius acting as her reluctant frontman in the Senate and Fulvia organizing fiercely behind the scenes, they raised 8 legions and seized the strategically vital city of Perugia, modern-day Perugia. Make no mistake, this was Fulvia's war. Ancient sources strongly suggest she was more invested in the conflict than Lucius himself. She rallied troops, stirred the public, and even corresponded directly with generals. Rome buzzed with rumors of her commanding legions, issuing orders, and forcing Lucius into confrontations he didn't actually want. Octavian, though initially surprised, acted quickly and decisively. He besieged Perugia through the brutal winter of 41 to 40 BCE, cutting off supplies and hammering the city into submission. Fulvia, stuck between dwindling food and political betrayal, watched her bold gamble unravel. By early 40 BCE, the city surrendered. Lucius Antonius was spared, likely as a pragmatic gesture to avoid fully alienating Mark Antony, but Fulvia was exiled. The woman who had once commanded riots, marriages, armies, and public opinion was now deemed too dangerous for Roman soil. She was sent to Sicyon in Greece, where she hoped to reunite with Antony. The once powerful alliance between husband and wife had eroded in the fog of war and distance. Fulvia had acted in his name, but perhaps without his blessing. She had dared to do what no Roman woman had before, wage a civil war, and now the Republic had made her pay the price. Banished from Rome, Fulvia landed in Sicyon, a city in Greece that had become a kind of diplomatic purgatory for failed power players. She had risked everything, her status, her alliances, her life, to defend Mark Antony's interests. But what awaited her in exile wasn't a hero's welcome. It was crushing silence. Antony did not immediately rush to meet her. In fact, by the time Fulvia arrived in Greece, Antony was already entangled with Cleopatra in Egypt. Whether their romantic relationship had fully blossomed or was merely brewing, the symbolism was devastating. While Fulvia was raising legions for him, Antony was raising goblets at banquets beside a queen. The betrayal cut deep, not just personally, but politically. Fulvia had fought a war to protect Antony's power in Italy, and in response, he essentially let her hang out to dry. Some ancient historians, especially Plutarch, suggest that Antony was genuinely furious with her for launching the Perusine War without his direct, explicit approval. Others argue he cynically welcomed her downfall, as it immediately cleared the way for a crucial marriage alliance with Octavian, something Fulvia would have never tolerated. Still, Fulvia was not entirely without supporters. Some of Antony's troops, fiercely loyal to her, urged reconciliation, but her health had begun to fail. After enduring siege, exile, and profound betrayal, Fulvia died in Sicyon in 40 BCE, possibly from illness, stress, or heartbreak, or perhaps all three. She was around 43 years old. Her death provided Antony with a clean political exit. He met with Octavian shortly afterward and agreed to marry Octavia, Octavian's sister, as part of a renewed peace treaty. The Triumvirs were temporarily united again, but only because Fulvia, the one woman bold enough to challenge their collective designs, was permanently gone. Fulvia's legacy would soon be overshadowed by Cleopatra, whose myth eclipsed nearly every other Roman woman of the period. But make no mistake, Fulvia was the prototype. She didn't wield power from behind a curtain. She marched directly into it, stood at the center, and dared to command armies in a world that primarily treated women as political furniture. Rome didn't know what to do with her, so it tried to erase her. But the ashes of her rebellion would linger, and her story was far from ordinary. After Fulvia's death, the men she had once maneuvered, Antony, Octavian, and even her former allies, began the quiet, deliberate work of rewriting her legacy. She couldn't defend herself, so the narrative was quickly shaped by her enemies and the uneasy survivors of her ambition, and like so many powerful women in history, Fulvia became a convenient scapegoat. Ancient sources, mostly penned by men with vested interests, painted her as the sole reason for the Perusine War, the rift between Antony and Octavian, and even the general disorder of the Republic. Appian, Dio Cassius, and Plutarch depict her as overbearing, jealous, and driven by an insatiable lust for power. They blamed her for dragging Lucius Antonius into conflict, for antagonizing Octavian, and even for Antony's eventual estrangement from Rome. But were these accusations fair? Hardly. Fulvia had merely operated within a political climate where violence and ruthless manipulation were expected if you were a man. She was no more ambitious than Caesar, no more aggressive than Pompey, and far less ruthless than Octavian would eventually prove to be. Her only true deviation was that she was a woman acting like a Roman man, and Rome simply didn't know how to digest that reality. She wasn't cloistered in the home, weaving quietly or serving as a political ornament. She was writing letters to generals, organizing street mobs, and commanding loyalty from veteran troops. And that made her dangerous, not just to Octavian, but to history itself. Even Mark Antony, the man whose legacy she had fought to preserve, conveniently blamed Fulvia for the civil strife. After reconciling with Octavian and marrying his sister, Antony used Fulvia's memory as a diplomatic cleansing tool. Her public dishonor became the price of his political survival. There were no monuments raised in her honor, no grand funeral, No morning speeches in the Senate, just a rapid, calculated silence. Yet her enemies couldn't erase her entirely. Fulvia had done too much. She had raised armies, steered elections, negotiated alliances, and fought a civil war. She was the first Roman woman whose name appeared on coinage, not as a deity or metaphor, but as a political agent. The damage to her reputation was deliberate, but so was her presence in the historical record. Despite every attempt to bury her behind caricature and slander, Fulvia refused to vanish. Her defiance still echoes. You just have to listen past the men. Fulvia's story ends in silence, but her legacy is anything but quiet. In the centuries that followed her death, historians and writers struggled to place her in Rome's grand narrative because Fulvia broke every rule of what a Roman woman was supposed to be. She didn't just advise power from the shadows. She became power, and that made her both unforgettable and deeply unsettling to a patriarchal world. In a society where women were expected to influence through whisper and marriage, Fulvia shouted through policy, war, and political theater. She was not a consort, she was a commander. And yet, she was remembered more for her defiance than her actual accomplishments. Roman historians couldn't handle a woman who didn't stay in her place, so they rewrote her as shrill, power-hungry, and disruptive. But read between the lines, and a different figure emerges. Fulvia was the first Roman woman to mint coins with her name. She organized political factions, leveraged marriage as a tactical weapon, and manipulated Roman street politics with stunning effectiveness. She moved through the civil wars of the 1st century BCE not as a bystander, but as a primary player, a woman whose influence terrified senators and shaped the fate of triumvirs. Her downfall wasn't due to incompetence, it was due to timing and gender. Had she been born a man, she might have been remembered as a second Caesar or a more charming Cato. Instead, she was cast as the wicked woman who dared too much. Still, her legacy quietly lingered. Later Roman women like Livia Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and even Cleopatra herself, though of a different world, would all operate in the shadow Fulvia helped carve. They would manipulate emperors, wield armies, and control succession. But Fulvia did it first, and with no imperial title to shield her. Today, modern historians have begun re-examining Fulvia with fresh eyes. No longer a simple cautionary tale, she is being recognized as one of the most politically active and formidable women in Roman history. Someone who tested the absolute boundaries of female power and paid the ultimate price. She didn't simply live in the age of triumvirs, she challenged them. And while Rome may have tried to erase her, Fulvia left fingerprints in every corner of its collapse. Not a footnote of force. A woman centuries ahead of her time. By the summer of 1963, the United States was a country teetering between two worlds, one rooted in centuries-old systems of oppression and another aching to breathe free. In the Deep South, segregation wasn't just a social norm, it was the law. Black Americans were barred from restaurants, schools, buses, voting booths, and even public drinking fountains. Police brutality was rampant, lynching still occurred, and in places like Birmingham, Alabama, peaceful protesters were being met with snarling dogs and high-pressure fire hoses. But change was coming, and it wasn't asking for permission. In just a few years, the civil rights movement had surged into the national spotlight. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and boycotts had become familiar headlines. Leaders like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and John Lewis were no longer just names. They were symbols of defiance and resilience. The March on Washington wasn't born out of a single conversation. It was the result of rising, collective frustration and fiercely held hope. Black Americans were no longer content with waiting. They were demanding civil rights, and they were determined to make their voices heard where it mattered most, the nation's capital. The idea of a mass march in Washington, D.C. had been floating around for decades. A. Philip Randolph, a renowned labor organizer and longtime civil rights advocate, had originally proposed the concept in the 1940s. Back then, it was meant to pressure the Roosevelt administration to desegregate the defense industry. That protest was called off after Roosevelt signed an executive order conceding to the demand. But now, in 1963, the stakes were even higher. Randolph, along with other civil rights leaders including Bayard Rustin and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., revived the vision. And this time, they weren't just marching for jobs. They were marching for dignity, for voting rights, for school desegregation, for equal pay, and most importantly, for the basic human right to live free of fear. Over a dozen major civil rights organizations came together to plan it despite their many disagreements, because they understood the power of a unified front. The countdown had begun. Buses were being organized. Flyers were spreading. Word of mouth was moving faster than newspapers. And across the country, Black Americans were preparing for what would become one of the most unforgettable moments in American history. The dream was taking shape, one footstep at a time. But everyone covered Dr. King's speech. That at least could not be ignored. President John F. Kennedy, who had initially opposed the idea of the march, watched it unfold on television with growing admiration and perhaps surprise. He called the event impressive and met with civil rights leaders at the White House immediately afterward, listening intently to their demands. However, legislative movement remained agonizingly slow. His proposed Civil Rights Act was still stalled in Congress, caught in the chokehold of determined Southern opposition. Some activists were naturally disappointed. They had hoped the march would result in immediate, sweeping action. Instead, it was back to the grueling grind, organizing, marching, resisting, and mourning those who paid the ultimate price for justice. Just weeks later, that grim reality hit hard with heartbreaking force. On September 15, 1963, 4 young Black girls, Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley, were killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama. The dream had been voiced, yes, but the nightmare wasn't over. The forces of hatred were fighting back violently. Still, something fundamental had changed. The March on Washington marked a new, inevitable phase in the civil rights movement. It proved that mass protest could be disciplined, powerful, and utterly impossible to ignore. It brought together a coalition broader than ever before. Labor unions, faith leaders, celebrities, students, and working-class Americans, all in one place, united by a singular demand for justice. And most of all, it gave the movement an immortal voice, a dream, a speech that would be quoted, studied, and echoed across the world for generations. The march was over, but the road was just beginning. And that road would soon lead through blood, landmark legislation, and national transformation. The March on Washington didn't just rattle the conscience of America. It fundamentally reshaped its moral and political landscape. What had begun as an audacious act of protest became a cornerstone of the civil rights movement's legacy, permanently altering how Americans understood justice, democracy, and the power of collective peaceful action. In legislative terms, the march didn't yield immediate victories, but it created an unstoppable momentum. Less than a year later, in July 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. It decisively outlawed segregation in all public places and banned employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. This pivotal act also established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EOC, to enforce these new anti-discrimination laws, marking a profound shift in federal responsibility towards civil rights enforcement. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act followed, striking at the very heart of discriminatory Jim Crow voting practices by banning literacy tests and providing federal oversight in areas with a history of low voter turnout. Would these bills have eventually passed without the march? Possibly. But would they have had the same moral force, the same undeniable, overwhelming public pressure? Probably not. The march made the inevitable necessary and urgent. For Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the speech that day propelled him into a new realm. He went from respected leader to global icon, a moral authority recognized worldwide. But fame came with a high cost: relentless surveillance, escalating threats, and ultimately, assassination in 1968. The dream he spoke of on those steps would become more poignant, more tragic, and more revered with each passing year. For the broader movement, the march showed what unity and strategic organization could achieve. It gave organizers a robust blueprint for large-scale mobilization, and it inspired a generation of activists both in the U.S. and abroad. Anti-apartheid organizers in South Africa, student protesters in Europe, and future human rights leaders across the globe would cite the March on Washington as a transformative model of effective resistance. But the legacy isn't just historical. The language of the march, the idea of jobs and freedom, the powerful image of peaceful resistance, the echoes of "I have a dream," still pulses through modern protest. From the Million Man March to Black Lives Matter rallies, echoes of 1963 reverberate with every chant and every cardboard sign in Washington, D.C. King's Memorial now stands just across the tidal basin from the Lincoln Memorial. Visitors walk past his towering likeness carved in stone, with words from that August day etched into the granite. But the real memorial isn't in stone. It's in classrooms, voting booths, marches, and voices refusing to stay silent because the dream wasn't meant to rest in history books. It was meant to be lived. And the legacy of that summer afternoon still dares us to do just that. More than 60 years have passed since that summer afternoon when over 250,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. The March on Washington has been immortalized in textbooks, documentaries, and museum exhibits. Dr. King's voice, steady and strong, echoes in national memory like a sacred refrain. But for many, the question remains: has the dream been realized, or has it merely been delayed? In some ways, progress is undeniable. The legal framework of segregation was comprehensively dismantled. Voting rights, though now under fresh assault in many states through restrictive laws, were won through blood, marches, and court battles. The presence of black lawmakers, judges, mayors, and even a two-term U.S. president, a figure who was entirely unthinkable in 1963, are tangible victories. Interracial marriage, once illegal in much of the country, is now protected by federal law. These are not small things. They are victories carved out by relentless, difficult struggle. And yet, the original demands of the march, the ones often overshadowed by the emotional power of King's speech, still echo unresolved. The call for a living wage is still unmet. The requested $2 minimum wage in 1963 would be equivalent to over $20 today, a benchmark still widely debated. Racial disparities in education, housing, employment, and healthcare remain deeply entrenched. For instance, Black Americans still face significantly lower rates of homeownership and higher rates of poverty compared to their white counterparts. Police brutality, the very thing that sparked much of the early civil rights organizing, continues to ignite outrage and protest movements like Black Lives Matter. The dream of true economic justice, of a country where opportunity is not predetermined by zip code or skin color, is still far from a shared reality. Modern movements like Black Lives Matter have taken up the mantle, often using the imagery and rhetoric of the 1963 march as both inspiration and indictment of slow change. They march through the same cities, chant on the same streets, and demand the same basic human rights. But they do so in a world transformed by social media, surveillance, and new forms of resistance. The March on Washington was never meant to be the conclusion. It was a flashpoint, a stake in the ground that said, "This is who we are, and this is what we demand." It was a declaration, not a resolution. So the dream remains, battered, challenged, reinterpreted, but fiercely alive. Whether it is deferred, distorted, or one day fulfilled depends not on the past but on us, on the choices we make, the injustices we confront, and the courage we summon to march again and again until the dream becomes a shared, lived reality for all.